Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Unpacking Islamophobia podcast from the Bridge Initiative here at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. My name is Arsalan Iftikhar. I am an international human rights lawyer, a senior research fellow at the Bridge Initiative, and author of the book Fear of a Muslim Planet: Global Islamophobia in the New World Order. My guest today is Laila Al-Arian, who is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines, which is an award-winning current affair program sponsored by Al-Jazeera English. Laila has produced documentaries on subjects ranging from the Trump administration's Muslim travel ban to the impact of the heroin epidemic on children, and an investigation into factory conditions producing garments for Walmart and Gap in Bangladesh. For her work, Laila has been honored with 2 News and Documentary Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, a Robert F. Kennedy Award in Journalism, Overseas Press Club Award, National Headliner Award, and she has been nominated for 19 News and Documentary Emmys. Prior to joining Fault Lines, Laila worked for Al Jazeera English's news department, covering everything from Guantanamo Bay's youngest detainee to the resettlement of Iraqi refugees in the United States. She received her degree in English literature from Georgetown University and a master's degree from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Salon, The Independent, and other publications around the world, and she is a co-author of the book Collateral Damage: America's War Against Iraqi Civilians. Laila Al-Arian, assalamu alaikum, and thank you for joining us today.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
Laila, my first question to you is always to my guests, it really is always a 30,000-foot altitude question, about the topic that we are discussing today. And so, as an American journalist of Palestinian descent who works for an international media outlet, I wanted to first ask you, what are your overall thoughts so far about both the differences and similarities that you see between how international media outlets and American media outlets cover Gaza over the last year?
Thank you for that question. Well, you don't actually have to be a journalist to see that there are some major problems with, in particular, the Western media coverage of what's happening in Gaza. And I see this every single day. I log on to Twitter or social media. People are complaining. They're saying, wait a minute, why is Israel not in the headline when Israel did this thing? Why does it constantly feel like a riddle or a whodunit when the Western media is reporting on actions that Israeli soldiers have done in Gaza? We've seen, certain headlines like "Lives Ended in Gaza," talking about the killing of Palestinians in large numbers. What lives? We see an overuse of the passive voice. Now, of course, I want to say I don't want to paint the entire Western media with a broad brush, because there have been good and important stories that many of these news organizations have done. But we have seen a pattern of some major issues. We've seen, in particular, some major Western media organizations from the very beginning, right after October 7th, disseminating unverified, sensationalist allegations, reporting them as fact, which then go on to shape the narrative. They go with these kind of big sensationalist headlines on stories that later on turn out to be debunked. And we see this oftentimes coincides with official Israeli state narrative. So you see Israel, the state of Israel, putting out a narrative, and then the Western media kind of falling into place and disseminating that narrative based on misinformation, disinformation, or straight up propaganda campaigns. We've seen this with allegations of alleged mass rape ordered and weaponized by Hamas on October 7th. This came out in a major New York Times article that came out on December 28th called "Screams Without Words," that has now been debunked, including by the United Nations in their own report that said that there was no mass rape that was weaponized by Hamas. You see this with Israel demonizing UNRWA, the UN relief works agency that works for Palestinian refugees, falsely smearing them as being members of Hamas or taking part in October 7th. And you see that they don't actually ever provide any evidence. We also saw that at the very beginning when Western media was talking about beheaded babies or babies, killed in ovens, or calling Al-Shifa Hospital a Hamas command and control node. What does that do? That actually helps Israel justify things like attacking hospitals. And of course, when you demonize Palestinians as mass rapists, then that assists in basically convincing the public to accept their mass killing. So you see stories being laundered from the Israeli PR machine, And then when those stories fall apart, you don't see any kind of acknowledgement for the harm that they've caused. And you also see that when it comes to, for example, media organizations like Al-Jazeera based in the Middle East, you talked about what's the difference. They're actually covering what's happening on the ground in Gaza because, you know, in this case, they actually have people on the ground. Again, I don't want to paint the entire Western media with a broad brush. There have been some really good pieces done from the ground in Gaza using local journalists, working with them. But the problem is those pieces are too few and far between, and they simply don't represent the entirety of the horrific humanitarian crisis on the ground there in Gaza. Again, you see a trend of every single day there's a story that's happening in Gaza that if it were happening anywhere else in the world, you could just imagine the wall-to-wall coverage. So you see an under coverage of atrocities, things like white flag deaths, things like the fact that children are dying of famine and starvation, the fact that the entire population is on the brink of famine right now, the fact that people are being displaced time and time again. 80% at least of homes in Gaza have been destroyed. The fact that people are living out of tents, all of these things, the coverage of what's happening in Gaza simply does not measure up to what's actually happening on the ground. It's not an accurate reflection of what's happening on the ground or the seriousness. Another problem I've seen is that you see things like sort of these manufactured controversies when you're spending hours and hours talking about chants being chanted at a protest. That takes attention away from what people are actually protesting, which is the severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So you see hand-wringing about, well, what do they mean when they say this? You see a complete intentional misinterpretation of people's motives and intentions, and this hyper focus on language when you have literally babies starving to death, being their limbs being amputated, being having to undergo surgery without any anesthesia, and on and on and on. And I think that this is these kind of distractions are intentional, and it's not journalism. You're doing your audience a disservice by not actually focusing on the journalism.
Yeah, you bring up some great points, Laila, and you mentioned October 7th, and I want to sort of focus on that for a few minutes and ask you that many media outlets across the West continue to frame the conflict in the region exclusively in terms of October 7th as their primary focal reference point, as though the Israeli-Palestinian conflict began on October 7th, 2023. So can you please unpack this a little bit and explain why this October 7th and pre-October 7th and post-October 7th media narrative framing is so problematic on a lot of levels?
Well, I think what it does is it tells you, it's a reflection of this sort of overall approach, oftentimes from the Western media, that does not hold Palestinian lives and Israeli lives equally. There's this inherent kind of suggestion that they're not equal in value, that Israeli lives matter more than Palestinian lives. You see that with sort of the normalization of Palestinian death. You can see the most horrific massacre happening on your social media. You're scrolling, you're seeing, a hospital bombed, you're seeing an attack that kills nearly 300 people. And that doesn't merit a breaking news alert on your phone. But, stories that are far less consequential do. So in terms of, is October 7th the beginning of history? Of course not. We know that Israel has been declared an apartheid state by many of the most, mainstream respectable human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. They've all said that Israel practices apartheid. We know that just last year, 2023, and the year before that, 2022, were two of the deadliest years for Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, where Israel has been killing hundreds of Palestinians. We know that there's very little coverage of the administrative detention that Israel puts Palestinians, including children, through, where they arrest people by the thousands and don't charge them with a crime. They just leave them there lingering under a military system. Every few years, Israel engages in mowing the lawn in Gaza, where they bomb the place, destroy it. Of course, nothing compared to what's happened in the last 8 months since October, but none of that context is included. It's as if, October 7th was the beginning of time, when you know that even the situation in Gaza, has been likened by people like Professor Norman Finkelstein as a concentration camp where people, Israel controlled whether they were able to enter or leave the Gaza Strip. They even controlled how many calories Palestinians were getting, the fact that they weren't even able to get building materials, the extremely high unemployment rate. Life before October 7th was extremely difficult for people in Gaza. And that is very important context to show, what was happening to the Palestinian people. But again, and then this is nothing to say nothing of what's happening in the West Bank, which is, of course, ongoing settlement expansion and land expropriation, settlers marching through, Muslim holy sites, and just the general system of occupation and apartheid that controls the lives of Palestinians daily. And then when you're talking about Palestinian citizens of Israel, it's living as second-class citizens. So when you don't cover their daily reality, the daily humiliation, the killing of Palestinians, then you're not doing your jobs as journalists and telling the full story of what's happening.
Staying on the subject of journalists, I think that one of the most underreported stories throughout this entire tragedy is how many journalists have been killed. As of June 13th, 2024, the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, has found that at least 108 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza, making it the deadliest period for journalists since CPJ ever started gathering data in 1992. So, Laila, as a journalist, can you please analyze this phenomenon, and why do you not think that there is universal outrage at the staggering number of journalists who have been murdered in Gaza in the last year alone?
Even after dozens of journalists in Gaza were killed last fall, I was attending events aimed at journalists, events in which journalists were getting awards for their courage and their bravery under fire. And I was shocked to see that my own industry had zero words for the killing of journalists in Gaza at some of these events, including events in Washington, D.C. How do you hold an event honoring courageous journalism and you don't have a single word to spare for the killing of Palestinian journalists? These numbers are unprecedented. This situation is unprecedented. Journalists in Gaza say they are being targeted when they wear their press vests and their helmets, when they're visually identifiable as journalists. We saw that with the killing of Al-Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. We see that with journalists in Gaza who say, some of them say we can no longer feel safe wearing our press vests because we believe that that actually puts us at risk. We've also heard that people no longer feel comfortable speaking to journalists in Gaza because they believe that journalists are specifically being targeted, and speaking to journalists puts them at risk. So these journalists are extremely courageous. They're working under the most unimaginable conditions possible, conditions that if they were anywhere else, they would be lauded for their courage, for their resilience, for their hard work, for their deep commitment to their profession. Instead, I believe some of this comes from this underlying premise that these simply aren't journalists. They're not colleagues. They're not people that are being viewed as equals in the profession. And that really breaks my heart because how can we give words to the importance of freedom of press, to the importance of independent journalism when we don't show solidarity and support to our colleagues in Gaza who are being killed in these unprecedented numbers? We saw that when the Pulitzer Prizes, which is the most prestigious award in print journalism here in the United States, when they honored journalists in Afghanistan, they named them. When they honored journalists in Ukraine, they named those journalists. When it came to Gaza, they did not have the moral courage to honor the journalists of Gaza. Instead, they said, we honor, people covering the war in Gaza, which some people on Twitter gladly accepted that award because, like, what does that even mean? Whoever is covering the war on Gaza, it's so vague, and it was intentionally so, and it was a betrayal of the courage and the commitment and the professionalism that these journalists are showing. It's just been profoundly disappointing to see the silence and the lack of solidarity from my field to these journalists.
My fourth question to you revolves around the hot button term genocide, which has become a loaded political football ever since the nation of South Africa brought a genocide case against Israel before the International Court of Justice in December 2023. Laila, how do you think the global media has handled the whole, quote, genocide debate when it comes to the Gaza war?
Well, the use of the term genocide was actually used by a number of genocide scholars who said that this is genocide, what's happening to people in Gaza. You had Roz Siegel, a scholar of genocide, say this is a textbook case of genocide. So this is not a controversial opinion. And of course, we have the ICJ decision saying that there's plausible genocide happening.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not something that, is controversial, yet you see a complete absence of the use of the word genocide in the Western media. We saw The Intercept reported a couple of months ago that the New York Times, there's a leaked memo that showed that there were certain words that reporters were discouraged from using, including occupied territories, ethnic cleansing, refugee camps, the word Palestine, and the word genocide. And what they say is that guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance, which of course many people would disagree with and say, in fact, that is taking quite a biased position to simply, discourage people from using words that are used by human rights organizations, by, legal experts, et cetera.
And my final question to you, Leila, is more of a personal reflection. As an American journalist of Palestinian descent, um, how do you cope with having to objectively perform your duties as a professional journalist on one hand, while also obviously watching these horrendous crimes against humanity, which are occurring against millions of Palestinians in the Holy Land today?
Well, I think back to something I heard actually the journalist from CNN, Christiana Amanpour, once say, which is be truthful, not neutral. And I think I am watching my colleagues in the Western media hand-wringing over phrases calling for freedom for Palestinians when entire families are being eliminated, when babies are being burned alive, when children are losing limbs. And they think they're being objective, but in fact, they are abdicating their duty as journalists to be truthful, to tell the truth about what's happening in Gaza. No one is asking journalists to be biased, to lie, to be deceitful. People are simply saying, do your job, tell the truth, report honestly and truthfully about what's happening on the ground in Gaza. And I think it's twofold. On the one hand, obviously, it's extremely difficult to see my mother's family, her extended family living in Gaza, just the unimaginable circumstances, forced famine and starvation, being displaced multiple times, not having access to food, water, fuel, the very basic necessities of life, constantly fearing for their lives. I think about what that must do to an entire people, 2.3 million people whose cortisol levels have been high for 8 months straight, just trying to survive and not even having a chance to grieve their loved ones, and what that does to a person emotionally, physically. I think about my grandfather who passed away in 2019 and what even happened to his body whenever I see Israel digging up graves. And then I think about just how outrageous and, disappointing the media coverage has been. Oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, echoing Israeli official state narratives or propaganda campaigns, publishing outright fabricated stories, or simply not measuring up in terms of really accurately reflecting the horror on the ground in Gaza as they would in other places. So I would say it's very difficult, setting aside what's happening on the ground, to see that either, there's censorship, lack of professionalism, double standards, and an inability to hold power to account and expose the abuses that are happening.
Finally, Leila, we were talking before the interview, and you mentioned that Al-Jazeera is coming out with a new documentary film about the crisis. Can you tell us a little bit more about your documentary?
Sure. Well, my show Fault Lines is coming out with a documentary called The Night Won't End, about what's happening in Gaza and U.S. support for the war. It focuses on 3 families in Gaza who've been through unimaginable horrors, one of which is the mother of Hind Rajab, the 6-year-old girl in Gaza who the whole world watched in horror as she pleaded for her life, and then Israel sadly killed her and the paramedics who went to go rescue Hind. So it's, I think, a very moving documentary. The Night Won't End. It will be available on YouTube, and I hope your audience checks it out.
Laila Al-Arian, thank you so much for joining us today for the Unpacking Islamophobia podcast.
Thank you for having me.
For more information, please visit bridge.georgetown.edu. We will see you next time. Thanks.